Different schools of thought have influenced the field of psychology throughout history, from the early functionalists like William James to the psychoanalysts like Freud and the post-Freudians, all the way to the cognitive revolution. One school that is often dismissed, however, is that of the behaviorists. In this video, I would like to make a special mention to the virtues of the behaviorist school of thought, whilst also addressing its perceived weaknesses. Behaviorism emerged gradually, as most schools of thought do, but it does have something akin to a founding moment. In 1913, John Watson published a paper called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. This paper outlined the basic premises of behaviorism. 1. For psychology to be studied scientifically, it should concern itself with observable phenomena. And 2. The only observable phenomena produced by the human mind is human behavior. Therefore, the science of psychology must concern itself with the interaction between stimuli and output, where output is observable behavior. So, what was so different about behaviorism at that time? Well, pretty much everything. Behaviorism was in many ways a reaction to the other influential schools of psychology at the time. Freud's psychoanalysis was focused on intrapsychic conflict and the causal powers of our unconscious desires. Functionalism and structuralism used introspection as the main method of inquiry, which was extremely subjective and based on a person's ability to report their inner experiences. The behaviorists saw these schools as unscientific, for they were trying to create a science out of unobservable and untestable hypotheses. Thus, they preferred a different view of the human mind, that of a black box, so to say. We can't see what goes inside one's head, but we can test what stimuli lead to different behaviors. Basically, we can treat the brain as a black box that creates output, and then simply measure what kind of input gives what kind of output. And that's how the behaviorist project began. After Watson's paper, behaviorism spread rapidly and dominated American psychology from the 1920s to the early 1940s. Some of its most influential developments came from the integration of Ivan Pavlov's research on classical conditioning, and later on from B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. Both forms of conditioning are, broadly speaking, theories of learning. Or to put it more specifically, they are theories that try to describe general learning principles that apply to humans as well as other organisms. Behaviorists went in that direction because they were less interested in the innate or natural characteristics of, let's say, each organism, and were more interested in the general structure of learning in the universal sense. In classical conditioning, a subject learns to associate a neutral stimulus with one that already elicits a response. For example, if every time you enter your favorite cafe, you order a cappuccino, eventually the sight of that cafe may evoke a craving for a cappuccino even before you consciously decide that you want it. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, focuses on how behavior changes through its consequences. Reinforced behaviors are more likely to be repeated, and behaviors that are not reinforced or are actively punished are less likely to be repeated. For example, if you consistently receive praise every time you clean your room, you are more inclined to keep doing it. Now, the philosophical foundations of behaviorism came under their strongest attack during the 1960s, during the rise of the cognitive revolution. Driven by major developments in linguistics and computer science, the new paradigm replaced the behaviorist black box with an equally compelling image: the mind as a computational machine. This model still dominates psychology today. Cognitive psychologists argue that between the presentation of stimuli and the production of behavior, there must be internal processes, what we might call cognition, like reasoning, remembering, planning, predicting, problem solving, and so on. These processes, they claimed, could not be reduced to simple associations or reinforcement histories. And to be fair, it is true that these mental operations had received very little systematic attention before the 1950s, and the cognitive framework filled a genuine gap in psychological theory. The shift was also empirically fruitful. Cognitive science gave rise to cognitive neuroscience, artificial intelligence, decision theory, computational modeling, and a vast body of experimental work. In the clinical world, the influence is equally clear. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is the most widely practiced therapeutic approach, and even schools that are not explicitly cognitive in orientation heavily emphasize cognitions, schemas, and internal mental models. So what's the hiccup? Why devote an article to behaviorism, a school of thought that is more than a century old and widely described as having been defeated by modern cognitivism? For me, the value of behaviorism never depended on its ability to explain every asset of the mind. In fact, behaviorism was never meant to function as an all-encompassing theory of human nature. Its strength lies in the deliberate narrowness that it has. Because in reality, behaviorism was designed to carve psychology into clean, workable domains. Neuroscience studies the physical substrate of mental life. Cognitivism studies the structure of internal processes, such as memory, planning, and reasoning. And behaviorism examines how all of this becomes action. How the organism's capacities, histories, and environments converge into one observable behavior. One way to think about it is through an economic analogy. Neuroscience is like studying the raw materials and the infrastructure of an economy. Cognitivism is akin to microeconomics, focusing on individual mechanisms, calculations, and decision rules. Behaviorism resembles macroeconomics, the large-scale patterns, the emergent regularities, the outcomes that arise when everything else interacts in real time. You can't reduce macroeconomics to microeconomics, just as you can't reduce behavior to pure neural firings or internal representations. Behaviorism's virtue is that it keeps psychology grounded in the observable actions that organisms actually produce. This analogy isn't perfect, but it captures the essence of this relationship. Behavior reflects emergent patterns that cannot be understood by examining internal mechanisms alone. At an even deeper level, if we treat behaviorism as purely a methodological perspective rather than a total theory of mind, it becomes clear that nearly every branch of psychology depends on its core insight. Consider a typical memory experiment. Participants are shown a series of stimuli and are later told them in order. Their pattern of correct and incorrect responses is then used to infer the structure of their internal cognitive processes. Although this is a quote-unquote cognitive design, notice what the inference rests upon. It is not the direct measurement of memory itself, but the observable behavior, i.e., the production of the answer. The same logic appears in neuroscience. Even the most sophisticated neuroimaging requires some kind of behavioral task: pressing a button, choosing between two options, recalling a word, detecting a stimulus. Neural activation only becomes interpretable when linked to an observable response. Without behavior, the brain data is just noise. In other words, neuroscience and cognitive psychology both rely on the foundational move that behaviorism insisted on, which is that to study what cannot be observed directly, we have to anchor our conclusions in what can be observed. In my view, John Watson and the early behaviorists made a philosophical shift in psychology that runs much deeper than we acknowledge. They stressed that psychological explanations should be anchored in observable relations between stimuli and behavior, not because the mind is simple, but because scientific inference requires stable and measurable facts. Without this grounding, psychological theories float freely and become indistinguishable from speculation. This insight continues to structure the field today. Even our most advanced methodologies, from cognitive models to neuroimaging, ultimately rely on the same logic. Internal processes are only meaningful insofar as they can be connected to observable behavioral patterns. And in that sense, behaviorism provides the methodological bedrock upon which the rest of psychology is built. And in the end, behavior is the thread that keeps the entire discipline tied to reality. And this is why I find behaviorism to be such an important aspect of psychology as a science. Thank you for listening and watching this video. If you want to read the article upon which this video is based, you can look at my Substack, which will be linked down below in the description of the video. But for now, thank you for watching.